mean, you couldn't drive down Division and not see a club.
From Lancaster all the way down to Sanford, it would be people going to the joints.
Johnny Taylor was there, B.B. King.
Fort Worth was the Bible Belt, and it was the Norris First Baptist Church. You know, he kind of controlled Fort Worth and held these people down. They could go to Arlington and have fun, and that's what they did.
It had all the beer joints, all the honky-tonks, had Top Hill Terrace at one end, the racetrack at the other, so we were covered.
You had church folk and you had people that partied. Arlington had several nightclubs, and most of the patrons were from out of town.
There was a whole lot of parties went on here in Arlington, especially on Division. Those two places, Lou's Blue Lounge and the Dragnet, helped make that hill what it is.
Of course, there was 2 or 3 gambling shacks.
Top of the hill where gambling took place, and
There's still gambling going on. What do you mean, was there gambling going on?
secret passages to get rid of all of the people when they were raided.
Gambling wasn't held in much disdain as it is, you know, with people now. It was nothing. It was just that's what you did.
At one point in time, Arlington was dry.
Bootlegging was a substantial business. And there were some sweet old ladies that were church mothers that would sit on their front porch with a towel folded 3 times, and in every fold there'd be a pint of liquor.
So all the liquor at the top of the hill, and any liquor probably that was drunk at the racetrack, it was not legal.
Even though there was trouble here now, you can't have a club without trouble.
I'm sure that a lot of police departments just look the other way.
Clubs and motels and car dealerships, that's it. They made that place what it is today.
It was bringing in money to the county. It was bringing in money to Fort Worth. So, money talks.
Arlington was a party town.
Black history is American history, and American history is complex. If you're going to faithfully tell it, you've got to embrace that some parts, well, they're just not pretty.
I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh,
North Texas was a hotbed of tension because in the years leading up to the conflict that we call the Civil War, in North Texas, there was a lot of concern that slavery wasn't accepted by everyone. And many of the leaders felt that traveling itinerant Methodist ministers were coming in and stirring up ferment among slaves and others, trying to maybe move them away from supporting slavery, supporting the South, supporting what would become one of the Confederate States.
At the end of the Civil War, Texas blacks were notified of their new rights as free citizens on June 19, 1865. This was known as General Order No. 3. For many of the formerly enslaved, their first action upon learning they were no longer property of another person was to go searching for brothers, sisters, wives, and mothers, those who had been sold away.
Still this sort of conflict over whether African Americans are really free or whether former slaveholders can continue to hold them into slavery. So it takes a while for the word to get across the state of Texas. Some African Americans don't become free until months after General Order No. 3. What African Americans do, indeed, they try to act on their freedom. They leave the plantations, they move to Houston, and they move to Dallas, they move to San Antonio. They create these communities called freedmen towns. They come into conflict with their former masters in many ways because they're trying to assert the fact that I no longer have to listen to you, I no longer have to work for you. In fact, you've got to pay me wages now.
I'll be buried in my grave. I'm going home to my Lord and be free.
Many of the former slaves began forming their own communities throughout East Texas and Southeast Texas, and even in places like Northeast Texas, in Dallas, there were freedom colonies, towns, communities formed by free blacks.
Mosier Valley being the oldest one that came out of a slave plantation community.
Not all slaves were uneducated. They had worked, they had helped build many of these empires that we had seen. They had been the managers, they had been the overseers. And so they took that knowledge that they gained and they applied it to their own communities and to their own families.
And the voting rolls for 1865 had a large number of black people that were registered. And at that time, it took $10 to register to vote in Tarrant County. That's a lot of money for a black man to put up to vote. They knew that voting was the way to get a better life. And the reason I know that the black people were registered to vote is because they had a C by their name that indicated they were colored.
Southern whites, and in fact many whites throughout the United States, had convinced themselves that Africans were uncivilized. They weren't like us, they said to one another. And so, in order to react to these people who they believed were subhuman, they felt that swift punishment was the only way to keep them in control. We do know that there were some very serious reactions. The rise of the Klan, that this fear that blacks would be able, by their numbers, could outvote and determine who would be political leaders, how money was going to be spent, was still a fear that a lot of whites carried with them.
Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man.
Now, if you read some of the scholarship of the time, you'll find there's a mass violence against African Americans, where they show some former slave owners just wantonly kill African Americans. In fact, they killed about 1% of the male population between 1865 and 1867 because former slave owners are trying to maintain their power and their, of course, control. They had to develop this elaborate sort of militia police system to police the slave population.
This is why you need something like the Klan, they said to themselves, to keep them in place. And who better than former Southerners, former slave owners, former slave drivers to run these organizations that, in secret, would terrorize black populations.
African Americans did not want to be enslaved. So they were always in rebellion and in some form of resistance. And so then you had to have this major police force, which of course was called basically the slave patrol, mainly poor white men carrying weapons, riding horses and policing districts in the South. Of the black codes, these are laws that were primarily aimed at formerly enslaved people. It said, for example, that by the January 1st each year, you had to have a work contract. And if you were not involved in a contract, then you could be arrested for vagrancy. Once you were arrested, then you could be hired out. A landowner can come in and sort of purchase you for a period of time, allegedly to work off your fine. By 1870, there's 10,000 African Americans in jail. Of course, developed that convict lease system where they hire them out and make them work for free. They began to use the criminal justice system as a way of controlling African Americans.
You know, we hear about random, senseless, unprovoked even, acts of violence. One of those stories is that of Fannie Wilson, who was the daughter of Jack Ditto. Jack Ditto, who was a Baptist minister, was off preaching, and terrorists, white night riders, we might say, came up and began inquiring about him. The daughter, Fannie, who was 15 years old at the time, says that she remembers them calling out for her dad, her mother saying, well, he's not here, and they began shooting.
And she's holding a baby in her arms, and they shoot through the house.
And one of those blasts killed the child and left a wound on the mother, both psychologically and physically, for the rest of her life.
Five blocks, maybe 1.5 square miles, in a town that began as a water stop for the railroad between Fort Worth and Dallas? It's easy to think it doesn't matter. But when you look at the hill, what you see is an American story, a family story, the story of us.
It was a safe place. It was just like, 3 block square, 4 block square. And I was safe.
People actually looked out for each other. People actually cared for each other.
It was just a community of love, a community of respect. We all worked together, and everybody was supportive of everybody. Don't get in trouble. Do what you're supposed to do. Know and understand right from wrong. Respect yourself and respect others. That was one of the main things.
Lesser desirable property. You have to remember that community came about after slavery ended, and the south side of Arlington was already pretty well white.
people probably in other parts of the country don't realize is that the South really wasn't that segregated in terms of where people lived. Some white families had their maids and servants live on their property. And there were little enclaves of black people living around each other. Here in Arlington, in old Arlington, you ran into people of all races. They didn't socialize, they didn't worship together, but they lived in proximity to each other. And over time, it just coalesced into the Hill.
I lived down what we call the pasture, and we would go over to the hill because that's what was happening. And we would love to get over on Indiana Street.
You had to go by everybody's house to go anywhere. I tell you what, when I was growing up, if you walked across in front of somebody's house and you didn't speak to them, when you got home, that was ass whooping. Because your parents would whoop you and say, hey, what do you think you doing? You think you grown?
The Hill, they were a close family in that community. And if things came up and there was a need, people pooled their resources. They got together to help one another.
I remember when we first moved to Indiana Street, we had old families. Somebody got sick. My mama would cook something and take it up there. You take it up there. Make sure they had something to eat. They were taken care of when they were old and sick. And that just kind of brought us all together.
My mother worked for a lot of white people. I asked the question once, why is it that their children can call you by your first name, but we have to say Mr. and Mrs.? And she said, because it's all right with me. She said, if it's all right with me, it's going to be all right with you. There are certain things that you just don't have to let bother you, because God's going to take care of you.
A good day was a day you didn't have to deal with white people. Because they would say something, they would do something, they would assume something, they exercise some right that they felt they had, and they could just ruin your day. You dealt with white folks as little as you could, because it was just so many opportunities for them to offend you and outright discriminate against you.
My mom and dad used to take my sister shopping to Leonard Brothers, big department stores downtown Fort Worth. And my sister would want to actually have ice cream at the counter. Wasn't allowed. And there was many times where she would go, want to try on a dress or whatever, and was denied.
They didn't go to the hamburger place. If they did, they had to go to the back door to get served. You know, maybe Bender's Dry Goods, and he was a Jewish shop owner here, and everybody was welcome in Bender's. But he had the cheapest clothes and the cheapest shoes that you ever saw, but he made no distinction.
They had a lot of white swimming pools here in Arlington, but we couldn't go to none of them. We used to ride our bicycles down Abram Street to go swimming in Grand Prairie.
Forest Park had the largest swimming pool, which we could actually swim in on the only day that we could go, June 19th. But on June 20th, they drained the pool and then filled it back up on the 21st to get ready for the white kids to come back. I mean, how crazy was that? It was crazy. So that white kids wouldn't have to be in water that black kids are swimming.
You better not go in the library. You know, they're going to try to kick you out if you insisted on being there. Call the police. Previous to integration, we had a bookmobile that would come to our community every other week, sent from the Fort Worth Public Library.
We didn't have a wash machine, but they had a washateria out in town. We couldn't go to it. When I had to wash, I'd put on a uniform and go right in there.
Then you'd get to ride the Fort Worth Greyhound bus if you wanted to go to the theater in Fort Worth. And so naturally we just went to the back. So you did whatever you had to do on the one that said, this is just the way it is, until it got better.
I grew up close to downtown, and like I said, walked to the movies from my house, and I never saw a black kid at the movies, you know. At least in Fort Worth, they had the balcony, you know, and you went up the back stairs and all. Here, there was no place for them to go.
They wore scars, you know, but they still made friends. You stay focused. You don't let that scar block you from growing, and you also keep the attitude of a Christian heart. And all people are not bad.
For blacks, the church was a place to worship the risen Savior, but because of Jim Crow, it had to evolve into a lot more. The church became the center of social, religious, and civic life for black people. By World War I, nearly 400,000 black Texans identified as active members of one of the principal denominations in the state. The church became the place where you were recognized as a whole human being, worthy of respect.
There were three churches, three different denominations. As a small kid, I was COGIC, I was Church of God in Christ. We were Pentecost. Walked around with a guilt complex. Every time we'd sin, we'd confess right on the spot. There wasn't a lot of status associated with being in the Pentecostal church. The oldest church was actually the Methodist church. It wasn't nearly as large or influencing the community as Mount Olive. Mount Olive was considered like the church, the community church.
Highest mountain that flows to the lowest valley. How many of you have had that blood applied to your life? And you know that same blood gives us strength from day to day. And it will never, everybody say never lose its power.
I guess my mom and her family were members of Mount Olive, and it's kind of a trailblazers, you know. And from there, it's just kind of like this home. You can go to church when you can't go nowhere.
Way back on.
Their church and their families are where they got their strength from. That it was just, you couldn't go down there on Sunday, you know, without almost the whole community being at church, one church or the other.
My mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother, they all went to the same church when it was in the middle of the street. But the church, I mean, if you didn't have anything else, I mean, you could depend on the church. If people were sick, she'd have them come to their house, you know, and pray for them.
One thing on Sundays, you knew it was church on Sundays down there because you didn't see nobody nowhere. You walk out there on the street on a Sunday, you didn't see nobody. If you sat down there and listened, you can hear nothing but church music and church singing and all that stuff. The only thing you're gonna see on them streets is a dog or cat or something, you know.
Regardless of what opportunities we were presented with, we also tried to stay focused on who got us there and who was opening up these doors for us. But religion had a whole lot to do with our communities.
But the other thing that the church did was it helped provide leadership skills. Those Sunday schools, those BTUs, those conferences for youth during the summer and the Bible schools, and where you had to prepare reports and you had to give speeches and you were taught how to run a meeting and learn Robert's Rules of Order. All of those things were taught in the church.
The synergistic nature of just being in the church, the positive things that the church was doing, the positive leadership that the church had, and it emboldened them. Our church was based upon the Word of God. And that's how we conducted ourselves in our life, and I'd say it turned out okay.
Education was instrumental in the search for an emotional place. Education brought a certain dynamism and vitality to Black folks. A world of possibilities began to emerge. Suddenly, it became clear that you could do more and be more than you ever thought possible. There's a reason that reading and education were denied you.
In Texas, all across the state, education is segregated.
The money wasn't spent on the school or the facilities at all, like it was for the white schools.
Education was key in the Black community at the time I was growing up. Many of us went to school knowing something about reading. We knew the alphabet. Plus, when you got there, you had teachers who were so invested in you that they made sure that you were going to learn, because if you failed, it meant they failed.
Booker T. Washington went from the 1st grade to the 8th.
I thought we had the best teachers around. I mean, you learned, they cared about you.
Those teachers, they would come to your house and they tell your parents, say, hey, look, your son or your daughter, they lacking a little education in this field. We're gonna come here every day and get them back up. When you're being taught by a certain race for a certain period of time, there's a bond and something that happens there that you can't escape from.
We didn't just look up to the educators. We looked up to the custodians, the cafeteria workers. All of those people had a say in our lives. All of those people could direct us in the right direction, if you will.
They taught so much more than algebra and English and history. They taught you how to live and how to survive.
Most cities in Tarrant County and these surrounding areas didn't have high schools for Blacks.
The 8th grade, it was as far as you could go in the Arlington School District. And that was a big discouragement to a lot of people. Plus, the assumption was that 8th grade education was about as much as a Black man needed.
If you lived anywhere in this region, basically, and you wanted to go past grammar school, past the 8th grade, you would have to go to I.M. Terrell.
You had to have decent clothes, you had to have money for lunch, you couldn't go home and eat lunch, and a lot of people just couldn't afford it. And that hurt the Black population in Arlington in advancing.
That the kids from Mansfield, for example, had to ride the Continental Trailways bus to downtown Fort Worth and then walk the mile to the high school. Those kids who got to the 8th grade in some of these cities and their parents didn't have the means to send them to a high school.
You lose those kids that didn't make it. Either they went on and either got into trouble or they just did what they had to do to make a living.
So they had to drop out of school, 8th grade. That was as far as they got. And I just wonder how many geniuses we left behind. But so society has a debt to pay for those souls and those minds that we lost because we didn't afford them the education that they wanted and certainly deserved.
Lou Henry Taylor and her sister, Lou Tom, were so influential on a lot of levels.
She was really, I guess, kind of like the mother of the Hill.
She was married to my daddy's brother. He was in the Navy, and my uncle used to gamble in the Navy. And every time he win money, he'd send it back home to her. And she got so much money, she had that club built. It was Lou's Blue Lounge. And my aunt, she had a nickname. They called her Ponytail. Before she got that club, she used to sell groceries, candy, and food out of her garage.
Lou Henry was a smart businesswoman. She ran a grocery store and a beer joint and a club.
Classy lady. She didn't like all that loud talking and cursing. She did keep her little bat and her pistol. No, you didn't run over her.
Lou Henry, through her store, she supported a lot of things that happened in the Hill.
She cared about the people that came to her club, and she cared about the church across the street.
Any of the churches that were in the neighborhood knew they could go in and get bread or ice or whatever they needed.
She supported school programs, she supported churches. She would help get people out of trouble, she'd loan you money. When people got sick, she would be the first one there. And it didn't matter if they were black, brown, or white. She fed them, she bought them clothes.
I mean, she had got a new Cadillac every year. She was always dressed perfectly and had a lot of friends in high places too. And I think the chief of police always took care of her.
Miss Taylor was not a lady who attended church every Sunday. She had many faces, but she had a really, really good heart. A lot of folk talk religion and they think it's going to church. No, be a doer of the word.
That's the kind of person she was.
So there's a new high school within walking distance of my house, but my parents can't enroll me. There's a clothing store down the street, but they won't take my $20 bill. There's a movie theater downtown on Center Street, but they won't let me in. My dad can't buy real estate unless someone else agrees to purchase it for him. What kind of trauma does this create?
Fear and distrust of anybody white. I said, I don't see how they ever got past that. And it was only through love in the community and in their own family that got them even halfway past that. It has to hurt you deep.
Had it not been for some strong parenting and some strong educators, it would have been more traumatic than it happened to be.
And when things are left out of history, it makes me wonder why.
We had a kindergarten program started at Mount Olive, and a white lady noticed me. She hugged me. White people ran the risk of being labeled too, because they'd call you a nigger lover right quick.
I went to Vandergrift's over here, right there off of Center and Division. That was Vandergrift's office, right there. And I walked right on in there, and I said, "How you doing, Vandergrift?" He said, "Do I know you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm one of your citizens that live here." And he said, "Yeah?" He said, "What is it?" I said, "Yeah, I need a new pair of shoes." I really did do it. And he gave me a voucher to go get me a new, me and my brother, a new pair of shoes. Sure did.
But if there is any teachable moments, the one thing that I think that should be retained, people don't seem to care about each other as much as they used to. Any success in life, someone along the way helped you. Someone along the way assisted you. Someone along the way gave you an opportunity.
You don't know what it's like to be living on 6th or 7th Street. It was kind of like the Twilight Zone, really, because we all sitting there and we have to know one another. We don't have no choice. And we have to become something greater than what's there already.
Despite the adversity, despite the hatred, despite the fear that they had to encounter on a daily basis, is that this is their home and that they made a life for themselves. I think that is the American story.
You know, you somewhere where you know somebody appreciate you, somebody love you, and that's a feeling that's hard to find, man.
I mean, it wasn't perfect, but you had just so many people that really, really cared about each other, and they believed in helping each other, and it was just there.
We call it LA, Little Arlington, the Hill, the ghetto. But if I was within the confines of my community, I was safe. Everybody I saw cared about me.